The rule was never written down, but everyone knew it. 5 feet. That was the distance the troop kept from him. Close enough to see him, far enough to pretend he wasn't really there. Visitors at the San Diego Zoo Safari Park would stop the moment they saw him. You could hear it in their voices, grown men lowering their tone, women whispering as if inside a church. "Oh my God, he's white. Is he real? He looks like a ghost." Phones came out. Children tugged on sleeves. Some people smiled. Some crossed themselves. A few said things like, "That's a miracle," or "He's beautiful." But inside the habitat, the reaction was very different. When Ivory moved, the others shifted away. Not in panic, not in anger. Just enough. Always enough. 5 feet. Ivory was an albino gorilla born into a world that had never made room for something like him. His fur was pale, almost silver white. His skin, where it showed, was light pink. His eyes, softer in color, reflected the sun differently. Even standing still, he looked like he didn't belong to the same picture as the others. He wasn't weak. He wasn't sick. He was strong, broad-shouldered, calm, a full-grown male with the weight and presence of a silverback. But difference has a way of rewriting the rules of strength. No one attacked him. That was the strange part. There were no scars on his body from fights he lost, no dramatic violence, just absence. When the troop gathered to rest, Ivory lay alone. When they fed, he waited until the others finished. When they groomed one another, their hands never reached for him. Once years earlier, when he was still young enough to hope, Ivory had tried to close the distance himself. It was a cool morning, the kind of California morning where the air feels clean and forgiving. The troop had settled into a loose rest pile near the rocks. Bodies pressed together, breathing in rhythm, sharing warmth the way gorillas always had. Ivory hesitated at the edge. He watched. He listened. He took a step forward. A low sound rose from the group. Not a roar, not a charge. Just a warning. A reminder. This is not for you. Ivory stopped. He didn't argue. He didn't challenge. He turned away and lay down beneath an open patch of sky. From that day on, he never tried again. At night, the difference became harder to ignore. When the temperature dropped, the troop retreated into the cave. You could hear them inside, soft grunts, shifting bodies, the quiet language of safety. Ivory remained outside, not because he was driven out, because no one made space. He slept under the stars night after night. The moonlight made his pale fur glow faintly, like he was cut from a different world. If loneliness has a sound, it was the sound of wind passing over him, while the others breathed together somewhere else. To the gorillas, Ivory was not a miracle. He was an omen. No one could say exactly when the belief began. Some of the older females avoided looking at him altogether. The younger ones copied what they saw. Among the troop stories passed without words. White meant wrong. White meant unnatural. White meant danger you couldn't name. And Ivory seemed to understand. He wasn't sad in the way humans expect sadness to look. He didn't cry out. He didn't pace or lash out. He watched. He learned. He adjusted. He learned when to move so no one felt challenged. He learned how far was too far. He learned that silence could be safer than sound. From the observation deck, Dr. Raymond Foster watched him one afternoon, arms folded, jaw tight. Foster had worked with primates for over 30 years. He'd seen aggression. He'd seen trauma. What unsettled him about Ivory was something quieter. "He's learned not to ask," Foster said softly to a younger keeper beside him. "Ask for what," she replied. "Belonging." Ivory sat near the far edge of the habitat, carefully arranging pieces of bark and stones in front of him. Not randomly, deliberately, he made patterns, lines, circles. When the wind disturbed them, he fixed them again. Inside the cave, the troops shifted closer together. The 5-foot rule held. Sometimes children would press their hands to the glass and wave. Ivory would glance up, eyes calm, unreadable. He never waved back. Not because he couldn't, because he didn't know what it would change. The contradiction was almost cruel. Humans adored him for the very thing that made his own kind reject him. Cameras followed him. Social media called him the white ghost. But admiration, Ivory had learned, was not the same as closeness. Late one afternoon, as the sun dipped low and painted the enclosure in gold, a young male gorilla wandered too close. Not aggressively, just curious. He stopped at the edge of that invisible boundary. 5 feet. Ivory looked at him. The young male froze. Their eyes met for a long second. Then the young male stepped back. No fight, no sound. Just the rule obeyed again. As evening fell, the troop moved toward the cave. Ivory remained where he was. The sky darkened. The first stars appeared. Ivory lay down beneath them alone, but steady breathing, slow heart strong. Rejected, yes, but not broken. He had learned something most never do. If the world refused to change, he would not beg it to. He would remain exactly who he was, and he would wait. Ivory did not give up on connection all at once. He tried carefully the way someone tries a door they already suspect is locked. At first, he copied what he saw. When the troop beat their chests, Ivory did the same. His hands struck his broad chest with strength and precision, but the sound came out different, duller, unfamiliar. A few heads turned. One female stiffened. Another moved her infant behind her shoulder. The message landed wrong, like a word spoken with the wrong accent. Ivory stopped. Another day he tried playface, lips parted, teeth barely visible. In any other gorilla, it would have meant harmlessness invitation. On Ivory's pale skin, it looked sharper. The pink around his mouth made the expression seem exposed, even threatening. A young male barked in alarm. Ivory closed his mouth and lowered his gaze. Each attempt taught him the same lesson. The gestures worked for them, but not for him. He was speaking the right language with the wrong body. What hurt most wasn't the rejection itself. It was the confusion. Ivory wasn't doing anything wrong. He was doing exactly what he was supposed to do. And still, the meaning twisted somewhere between intention and perception. So he adjusted again. He became quieter, slower. He stopped initiating anything that might be misread. Instead of approaching, he observed. Instead of signaling, he waited. Over time, the troop stopped reacting to him altogether, not because they accepted him, but because he had learned how to take up less space. From the outside, it looked like calm. From the inside, it was constant calculation. Dr. Raymond Foster noticed the shift. Foster had spent decades watching primates communicate without words, but Ivory forced him to pay attention in a different way. The gorilla wasn't withdrawing out of fear. He was adapting. "That's not submission," Foster said one afternoon, watching Ivory sit alone near the edge of the enclosure. "That's strategy." The younger keeper beside him frowned. Strategy for what? For surviving without being seen as a threat. Foster understood that kind of survival. Years earlier, after returning from military service, he'd come home to a family that didn't know how to read the quieter version of him. He spoke less, reacted slower. He was still the same man, but the language he used no longer matched the room he was in. Ivory reminded him of that feeling, being fluent but never understood. To give Ivory stimulation without forcing social interaction, the keepers introduced a new enrichment activity. They scattered objects, stones, fruit peels, wooden blocks throughout a section of the habitat. The task was simple: find the hidden food by following patterns. The other gorillas rushed in, first grabbing what they could, competing loudly. Ivory waited. He always waited. Then methodically, he began to work. He ignored the obvious pieces and focused on alignment, where stones curved unnaturally, where fruit peels were placed too neatly to be random. His hands moved with quiet confidence. One by one, he uncovered every hidden reward. Faster than any of the others, no celebration followed. No one joined him. He ate alone. From the observation deck, Foster exhaled slowly. "He's brilliant," he said. "And it doesn't matter." The younger keeper looked confused. "Doesn't matter, not to them," Foster replied. "Being right doesn't make you belong." Ivory finished the task and sat back, holding a piece of fruit loosely in his hand. He glanced toward the troop. They were already busy with each other, chattering softly, grooming, touching. He didn't move closer. Something had shifted inside him, not toward bitterness, but toward clarity. Ivory began to understand that no amount of effort could make others hear a language they weren't listening for. The problem wasn't his intelligence or his intent. It was the space between him and them, shaped by fear and unfamiliarity. So Ivory stopped trying to translate himself. He focused instead on being consistent, predictable, calm. When storms came and the troop crowded together under shelter, Ivory stayed just far enough away to avoid tension. When food was scarce, he waited last. When infants screamed, he moved slower, softer, making sure no one mistook his presence as interference. He wasn't withdrawing, he was choosing peace. Foster noticed something else too. As Ivory stopped forcing connection, the troop's anxiety around him softened not into affection, but into tolerance. The sharp reactions faded. The warnings became rarer. One afternoon, a young gorilla wandered into Ivory's space without realizing it. The distance closed to 4 feet. Ivory did nothing. He didn't stiffen. He didn't stare. He continued arranging small pieces of bark on the ground, hands steady. The young gorilla blinked unsure. Then he turned and walked away. No alarm, no escalation. Foster nodded to himself. That, he said quietly, is emotional intelligence. Ivory had learned a truth most never articulate: forcing yourself to fit only sharpens the edges that make others afraid. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stop performing. As the days passed, Ivory's solitude began to look less like isolation and more like presence. He was always there, always calm, always himself. And somewhere in the troop's shared awareness, something subtle began to change. Not acceptance, but curiosity. Ivory didn't notice it yet. He had learned not to expect anything. He simply remained where he was, speaking a language made of patience, waiting for someone who might one day understand it. Ivory noticed her before anyone else did, not because she was loud or bold or important in the hierarchy, but because she stopped when everyone else kept moving. Her name was Luna. She was younger than most of the females, smaller in frame, quick in motion. She had the restless energy of someone not yet trained by fear. While the rest of the troop navigated the enclosure with practiced caution, who to approach, who to avoid, Luna wandered. She looked, she lingered, and one afternoon, she lingered too long. Ivory was seated near a patch of dry ground, carefully arranging melon seeds he had saved from feeding time. He placed them one by one, spacing them evenly, forming a loose spiral. It wasn't a game meant for anyone else. It was simply something that made sense to him. Luna slowed as she passed. She didn't stop right away. She circled once, pretending not to look. Then she turned her head and stared openly. Ivory felt it immediately. The attention, the closeness. He did not react. That was what made her stop. Luna took a step closer, then another. The invisible boundary, the one everyone else obeyed without thinking, began to bend. Ivory kept his eyes on the ground, his hands still. No signals, no warnings, no invitation that could be misunderstood. Just calm. Luna crouched a few feet away. She tilted her head, studying the pattern of seeds. Her fingers twitched. Slowly, she reached out and picked one up. Ivory didn't flinch. Instead, he took another seed and placed it beside the others, adjusting the spiral. A quiet offer. Not food, not dominance. Something else. Understanding. Luna hesitated, then placed her seed down too. Not where Ivory had placed his, but close enough to belong to the shape. For several minutes, neither of them looked at the other. They worked side by side, rearranging the seeds, building and rebuilding the pattern as if they had always known how to do this together. From a distance, Dr. Raymond Foster stopped mid-sentence. "Do you see that?" he asked softly. The keeper beside him nodded, afraid to move. "This isn't play," Foster said. "This is communication." The moment could have ended there. Most moments like that did. A call from another gorilla, a warning grunt, fear stepping back in. It didn't. A sharp sound broke the air as an older female noticed Luna's position. She moved quickly, placing herself between Luna and Ivory, letting out a low protective call. Luna froze. She looked from the female to Ivory. The choice hung in the air. For the first time since anyone could remember, Ivory looked up. Not at the female. At Luna. There was no plea in his eyes. No expectation. Just presence. He was not asking her to stay. He was allowing her to leave. Luna shifted her weight. Then slowly, deliberately, she stepped back, but not all the way. She sat down just outside the older female's reach, eyes still on the seeds. It was enough. Later that day, rain drifted in, unexpectedly light and cool. The troop reacted as they always did, gathering closer, seeking comfort in routine. Ivory moved toward a sheltered area and stopped, giving space. Luna didn't. She ran through the drizzle, laughing in the way young gorillas do, darting and circling. Then she did something no one expected. She dropped to the ground and rolled. Once, twice. When she stood, her dark fur was streaked with pale dust clinging to her shoulders and arms. She shook herself and looked at Ivory, almost playful. She hadn't tried to change him. She had changed herself. Ivory stared, stunned, not by the act, but by what it meant. Luna wasn't masking fear. She was rejecting it. She bounded toward him, stopped short, then darted away again. A challenge. An invitation. Ivory hesitated. For years he had learned that movement invited misunderstanding. That excitement looked like threat. That stillness was safer. Luna waited. The rain softened the world around them, muting the sharp edges of sound and hierarchy. Ivory took one step forward. Luna squealed and ran. Ivory followed. Not fast, not chasing, just enough. They moved through the open space in looping paths, never touching, never colliding. A game without rules, without winners. For a moment, the hierarchy dissolved. There was no silverback, no outsider, just two gorillas moving in shared rhythm. The older members of the troop watched in silence. No alarm came. No aggression followed. When the rain faded, Luna slowed and dropped beside Ivory, breathing hard. She leaned back just slightly close enough for her shoulder to brush his arm. Ivory did not move away. Foster felt something tighten in his chest as he watched. "She's choosing him," he said quietly. "And she knows what that costs, because it did cost something." That evening, Luna was pulled back into the group more roughly than usual. A warning was issued. Boundaries were reasserted. Ivory saw it all and did nothing. He would not be the reason she suffered. The next day, Luna returned anyway. Not boldly, not defiantly, just consistently. She sat near Ivory when she could. She mimicked his calm. She watched the patterns he made and added to them without disrupting their shape. Sometimes they shared space without interaction at all. It wasn't romance in the way humans imagine it. There was no ownership, no protection claimed. It was something rarer. Choice. Luna chose curiosity over fear. Ivory chose trust over withdrawal. And slowly and possibly, the space between them stopped being a warning and started being a bridge. Ivory had spent his life learning how not to disturb the world around him. Luna was teaching him something new, that sometimes the world changes, not because someone demands it, but because someone dares to stay. The tension didn't arrive all at once. It crept in quiet at first, the way danger often does. The aging silverback had begun to slow. His back was still wide, his presence still commanding, but the pauses between his movements lasted longer now. The younger male noticed. He was broader through the shoulders, quicker to react, less patient with ritual. His chest beats came sharper, closer, aimed not at the troop but at the future. Everyone felt it. The females gathered their infants tighter. The younger gorillas stayed near cover. Even Luna's playful wandering narrowed her eyes, flicking more often toward the center of the enclosure. Ivory watched it all without comment. He had seen storms before. Not fights, he had never been part of those, but the signals that came before them. The air thickened, movements shortened, sounds lost their softness. Dr. Raymond Foster stood at the observation deck longer than usual those days. "This is how it starts," he said quietly. Not with violence, with certainty. The breaking point came on a hot afternoon, the kind where patience thins faster than shade. The younger male moved too close. The silverback responded with a warning roar that echoed against the rock wall. The younger male didn't back down. He roared back. The sound cracked through the enclosure. Infants screamed. Females scattered. Dust rose as bodies shifted, bracing for impact. Ivory stood up. It was not instinct, it was decision. He stepped forward into the open space between them. For a split second, everything froze. Two massive gorillas, squared off muscles, coiled, breath heavy, and between them stood Ivory, pale, silent, unmoving. He did not chest beat. He did not roar. He did not bare his teeth. He simply stood. The younger male faltered first. His aggression had been built for challenge, for escalation, for dominance answered by dominance. Ivory gave him nothing to push against. The silverback hesitated too. This was not a scenario written into instinct. The rules did not cover a figure who refused to play either role challenger or defender. Ivory's presence bent the moment in a way force could not. The younger male took a step forward, then stopped. His breathing slowed. Confusion crept in where adrenaline had been. Ivory met his eyes not with challenge, not with fear, but with stillness. Seconds passed. Long ones. Then without ceremony, the younger male turned away. The silverback exhaled a deep sound that settled the dust in the air. He moved off in the opposite direction. The fight ended without a blow. Dr. Foster's hand tightened on the railing. "He just did something extraordinary," he said, barely above a whisper. What the keeper beside him asked, stunned. He gave them a third option. Afterward, the enclosure felt different, quieter, not peaceful yet, but altered. Ivory did not claim space after the incident. He did not posture. He did not seek acknowledgement. He returned to his place near the edge as if nothing had happened. That was when it began. A female approached him slowly, cautiously. She was older, her movements measured by experience. She stopped just short of touching distance. Ivory stayed still. Her hand lifted, hesitated, then settled gently on his shoulder. The touch was brief, almost accidental, but it carried weight. Ivory's breath caught. He did not turn. He did not react. Years of restraint held him in place. The hand returned, then another. Grooming. The sensation rippled through him, foreign, overwhelming. Fingers moved through his pale fur, careful at first, then more assured. Each touch carried something Ivory had not felt since he was very young. Belonging. He closed his eyes. Across the enclosure, Luna watched unmoving. Her chest rose and fell slowly, relief softening her posture. She did not approach. She didn't need to. The message had already traveled. Over the following days, something unexpected happened. Infants wandered closer to Ivory, drawn by his calm. They climbed near him, tugged at his fur, laughed in their high-pitched way. Ivory did not pull away. He became stiller than ever, a quiet anchor in the chaos of youth. The infants learned quickly that his pale color did not mean danger. It meant warmth without force. The adults noticed. Dr. Foster did too. They trust him with what they protect most, he said. That's not tolerance. That's acceptance beginning. Ivory had not earned this by strength or intelligence or persistence. He had earned it by restraint, by standing between two forces without choosing either, by refusing to mirror violence with violence. Luna finally joined him one evening as the sun dipped low. She sat beside him close enough that their arms touched. Ivory did not shift away. They stayed like that, watching the troops settle the tension of days past dissolving into routine. Ivory had spent his life learning how not to disturb the world around him. That day, the world had shifted anyway, not because he fought for it, but because he stood still long enough for others to see what he had been all along. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday. No storms, no tension in the air. Just a clear California morning sunlight stretching slowly across the enclosure, as if nothing important was about to change. Ivory woke where he always did, near the outer edge where the ground was firm and familiar. He rose, shook the dust from his pale fur, and paused. The troop was already gathering bodies, moving toward one another, with the quiet certainty of habit. For years, this was the moment when Ivory stopped. 5 feet. Always 5 feet. That morning, no one moved away. At first, Ivory didn't notice. He took a step forward, then another, expecting the subtle shift, the quiet correction that would send him back to the margins. It didn't come. The troop continued, settling shoulders, brushing, breathing, overlapping. Ivory froze. He stood there unsure, not afraid but cautious, in the way someone becomes cautious after a lifetime of learning where they are not supposed to be. The space in front of him remained open, an invitation that did not come with a sound. Ivory lowered himself slowly, his massive frame folded with care as he lay down at the edge of the rest pile. Still no one reacted. Then Luna moved. She crossed the remaining distance and curled beside him without hesitation, her back resting lightly against his arm. It was not dramatic. It was not announced. It was simply done, as if this had always been the next step. Another body settled nearby, then another. Ivory found himself surrounded, warmth on every side, breath rising and falling in rhythm with his own. The circle, once broken, closed naturally around him. For the first time in his life, Ivory lay at the center. Dr. Raymond Foster watched from the observation deck, eyes stinging unexpectedly. He had spent years recording behaviors, charting patterns, measuring stress levels and social bonds. None of those metrics prepared him for this. They didn't change him, he murmured. They changed their idea of him. Ivory remained perfectly still, not out of fear this time, but reverence. Every muscle in his body remembered what it had cost to get here. He felt the press of bodies, the warmth he had watched others share for so long. It was almost overwhelming. No one groomed him at first. They didn't need to. Presence was enough. As the sun climbed higher, the troop began to stir. Infants climbed over backs and shoulders, laughter breaking the quiet. One small gorilla clambered clumsily onto Ivory's chest and sat there tugging gently at his fur. Ivory did not flinch. The infant laughed again. Across the enclosure, something subtle had changed. The usual undercurrent of tension, the small constant reminders of rank and caution had softened. Movements were slower. Conflicts dissolved before they formed. Foster noticed the data shift within weeks. Lower stress indicators, fewer aggressive displays. The troop, once rigid in its structure, had become something else, more patient. Ivory had not become their leader. He had become their center. Luna remained close but never possessive. She did not guard him or cling to him. Their bond was quiet, built on shared space rather than constant contact. Sometimes they sat together, sometimes they didn't. What mattered was the absence of fear. Visitors still gathered when they saw Ivory. They still whispered, still took photos. But the story they were witnessing had changed. He was no longer the white ghost on the outside. He was part of something. Late one afternoon, as shadows lengthened and the troop prepared to settle again, Ivory felt something brush his hand. A female had reached out without looking, fingers moving automatically through his fur. Grooming, absent-minded and unremarkable. Ivory closed his eyes. He had spent his life believing the world would never make space for him. That acceptance required performance or change or compromise. He had been wrong. The world had not changed for Ivory. Ivory had stayed. He had stayed calm when misunderstood, stayed gentle when feared, stayed himself when silence would have been easier. And in time, the world around him learned to stay too. Dr. Foster wrote his final note in the log that evening and closed the file. The presence of a non-aggressive, non-dominant male, he wrote, has reshaped the social fabric of the troop. He paused, then added a line not meant for data. Difference did not weaken them. It taught them. As the light faded, Ivory remained where he was, no longer at the edge, no longer alone. Luna rested nearby, her breathing slow and steady. Around them, the troop settled into sleep bodies, close the circle complete. Somewhere beyond the enclosure, people would watch this story and see a gorilla who found love late in life. But those who looked closer would see something deeper. That sometimes belonging is not something you fight for. Sometimes it arrives quietly when you stop trying to be anything other than who you are. Ivory's story does not end with applause. It ends with something quieter and far more powerful. He was born into a world that noticed him immediately and misunderstood him just as quickly. His pale fur made him visible before it made him welcome. From the first days of his life, Ivory learned a lesson most of us spend decades learning. Being different does not always invite curiosity. Sometimes it invites distance. For years, he lived on the edge of belonging, close enough to observe connection, too far to participate in it. He was not chased away. He was not attacked. He was simply left out. And in many ways, that kind of rejection cuts deeper, because there is no moment you can point to and say that's when it happened. It happens slowly, quietly, until isolation feels normal. Ivory tried to bridge the gap the only way he knew how. He learned the language of his troop. He copied the gestures, the rhythms, the signals. He did everything right, and still it didn't work. Not because he was wrong, but because the world around him was not ready to see him clearly. That is a truth many people understand all too well. Some of us grow up speaking the same language as our families, working the same jobs, living in the same places, and still feel like outsiders. Not because we lack effort, intelligence, or heart, but because something about us does not fit the expectations placed upon us. We learn to soften our voices, to take up less space, to stop asking for warmth we don't believe we're allowed to have. Ivory reached that place, not with bitterness, but with clarity. He stopped trying to perform his way into acceptance. He chose instead to be steady, present, himself. That choice did not change the world overnight, but it changed him, and that changed everything else. When Luna entered his life, she did not rescue him. She did not fix him. She did something far more radical. She saw him without fear. Her curiosity was not reckless. It was honest. She did not approach Ivory because he was different. She approached him because he was calm, consistent, and real. Love in its truest form often begins that way. Not as a grand gesture, but as a choice to stay present when fear tells you to pull away. Their bond was never loud. It was never possessive. It didn't demand attention. It existed in shared space, in quiet games, in moments where nothing needed to be proven. And in that space, Ivory did something no one expected. He became the center without trying to be. When conflict threatened to tear the troop apart, Ivory didn't fight for dominance. He didn't shout louder. He didn't strike first. He stood still. In a world built on force and reaction, his restraint created something entirely new, a pause. That pause changed the outcome. It allowed others to step back from instinct and choose something different. Safety without submission, strength without violence, leadership without fear, and slowly the troop transformed. They became calmer, more patient, more open. The very difference they once avoided became the stabilizing force they didn't know they needed. Ivory didn't earn his place by changing who he was. He earned it by refusing to abandon himself. That is where the story reaches beyond gorillas, beyond enclosures, beyond the boundaries of species. Because this is not just a story about an albino gorilla who found love late in life. It is a story about what happens when someone stays gentle in a world that misunderstands gentleness as weakness. It is about what happens when someone refuses to mirror the fear placed on them. It is about the quiet power of presence. So what is the lesson here for us in our lives right now? The first lesson is this: belonging cannot be forced. You can work harder, speak louder, prove yourself endlessly, but true belonging doesn't come from performance. It comes from alignment, from being in spaces that recognize your value without requiring you to erase yourself. If you are spending your life trying to earn permission to exist as you are, it may not be you who needs fixing. It may be the environment. The second lesson is harder and deeper. Staying yourself takes courage. Ivory could have hardened. He could have withdrawn completely. He could have responded to fear with aggression. Many would have understood if he had, but he didn't. He chose consistency over resentment, patience over bitterness. In human terms, this means choosing integrity even when it doesn't pay off immediately, choosing kindness when cynicism feels safer, choosing restraint when retaliation feels justified. That choice will not always be rewarded quickly. Sometimes it won't be rewarded at all, but it changes the kind of person you become. And sometimes, quietly, unexpectedly, it changes the people around you too. The third lesson is about love. Love is not possession, it is permission. Luna did not claim Ivory. She did not isolate him from others or demand his loyalty. She allowed him to be fully himself in her presence. That is what made their bond strong. In our own lives, the healthiest relationships are built the same way. Not on control, not on fear of loss, but on mutual respect, space, and trust. And finally, perhaps the most important lesson of all, the world does not always change first. Sometimes you stay true long enough that the world catches up. Ivory did not wake up one morning accepted. He stayed through the loneliness, through the misunderstanding, through the silence. And when the moment came when the circle finally closed, it felt natural, not forced. If you are someone who feels unseen, unheard, or out of place, Ivory's story is not telling you to wait passively for change. It is reminding you that your presence matters more than your performance. That who you are as you are has value even before anyone else recognizes it. And if this story resonated with you, if it made you reflect on your own life, your own struggles with belonging, then you are exactly why this channel exists. We tell these stories to remind you that quiet strength matters, that compassion leaves a legacy, that even in the wildest places, gentleness can reshape the world. If you believe in stories like this, stories of resilience, connection, and hope, please subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue sharing meaningful stories that stay with you long after the video ends. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And thank you for believing that sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones told softly.